Hi, I'm Lydia Tackett. I'm a professor in the Geosciences department here at NDSU. I am a paleontologist, which means that I study fossils and especially how organisms in the history of life on the planet have interacted and been affected during interesting intervals of Earth's history. So I'm really excited to get the chance to meet with you, and if you have any questions about paleontology or any of the projects that I'm talking about here in this video, even if you're not able to participate this year, I hope you'll think about scheduling a Zoom meeting with me, and I really look forward to talking with you. I'll quickly go over some of the classes that I teach here at NDSU, and then I'll finish by talking a little bit about my research, and especially the research that I'm proposing that we collaborate on this summer. So of the 5 classes that I teach over the course of 2 years or so here at NDSU, the first is Invertebrate Paleontology and the Field Paleontology class. So in this class, we learn about all kinds of invertebrate fossils, especially the ones that can be found here in North Dakota and Minnesota and Montana. Here's a big inoceramid bivalve, and they're super abundant in sedimentary rocks out in western North Dakota. We usually do a big field trip for this class where we go out east and learn about the origin of complex life on the planet. It's a great field trip class. I also teach the Oceanography class, which is in many ways quite similar to invertebrate paleontology, except everything's alive. So invertebrate paleontology looks at life through time. Oceanography mainly focuses on what's going on right now. And we look at all the different types of organisms in the ocean, how they interact with ocean chemistry, how atmospheric interactions affect the oceans, how the oceans affect weather patterns here in the middle of North America. I also teach the Astrobiology class in the honors program, which is a 1-credit class where we learn about how life evolved on our planet and how life interacts with aspects of our planet that make it so that life is visible from space, and that we can use these ideas of how life evolved here and how it can be recognized to look for life elsewhere in the universe. I also teach the Sedimentology and Stratigraphy course, which is where we look at sedimentary rocks and figure out how we can interpret the types of environments that they represent. And this is really useful for helping us understand about how different environments evolve over time. And then finally, I teach an introductory class here at NDSU called The Earth Through Time. So if you end up coming here to NDSU and you need an introductory science class, I teach Geology 106, which is a really fun class where we learn about basically how the planet and life have co-evolved over 4.5 billion years. A real quick history lesson, basically. So what I research actually kind of reflects those courses that I teach, which is all about the interaction between life on the planet and the planet, and how physical and biological things interact to create a fossil record and what the fossil record can tell us about how life has changed on the planet. So if you think about geologic time as a stack of rocks where the youngest are on top, basically anything you're walking on today, things that are forming rocks now and aren't rocks yet, going back down, further back in time, all the way down to the origin of the planet 4.5 billion years ago. The rocks that I study are kind of right in the middle there during the Triassic period. And I like the Triassic period because a whole bunch of really interesting things happen during the Triassic, and especially at the end of the Triassic period. There's mass extinctions, there's giant volcanoes, there's asteroid impact events. So I study a lot of different kinds of organisms and a lot of different types of geologic events that I find interesting, but they all exist in the Triassic period. So that's something that kind of ties these things together. So among the interesting things that are happening during the late Triassic and the kind of research questions that I seek to answer, a lot of them involve plate tectonics. So here is what the planet looked like during the latest part of the Triassic. The supercontinent Pangaea was still together, and during the late Triassic, it started to rift apart. And when those continents started to pull apart, new ocean formed in the middle. But to get new ocean forming in the middle, basically it rifted the tectonic plates apart, causing enormous amounts of volcanic activity, and volcanic activity that ended up affecting global ocean ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems too. So some of the questions that I study relate to these events. So it's about how climate changed and how we got mass extinctions as a result of volcanic activity. Another thing that I study has to do with looking at the ecosystems of the oceans themselves during the late Triassic, when it seems like there were some interesting changes in the types of predators that were appearing in the oceans. And a lot of these predators were extra specialized for shell crushing. So thinking about organisms that live in the ocean, think about like clams and snails and stuff like that. During the late Triassic, a whole bunch of predators showed up that were especially adapted for crushing these things, and we can tell that because of their teeth. So figuring out how predators and prey interacted with each other and led to interesting adaptations in both of them is an aspect of my research. So looking at ecological change and how predators and prey drive those changes. Again, all of these things happen in the late Triassic, so these are, in terms of time, occurring in similar time intervals. So how do I collect this data? How do I learn about climate change, mass extinctions, volcanoes, ecological changes? We need data. So the type of data that I collect, I go out to places where there are rocks that were deposited in the oceans or formed in the oceans and are now on land, so that I can actually collect them from land. And they get on land through plate tectonics, basically. So one of my field localities is in New Zealand. So here we are driving around on some farmland looking for stacks of sedimentary rocks. So there's my graduate student, Annika. She's pointing at some potential outcroppings of rock. We usually go to New Zealand in December. And that's their winter, so we're able to do our field work then. And then ideally what we want to do is try to find these types of stacks of sedimentary rocks. This is not in New Zealand. This video is actually in Death Valley, California. And what I'm pointing to in this video are flat layers of sedimentary rocks. And what we'll do is when we find those flat kind of layer cake stacks of sedimentary rocks, we'll collect large samples of rocks with our hammers. Just go up to these outcroppings of rock, smash them up, fill a bag with it, take it back to the lab, and start trying to identify the fossils that we find in those samples. So what we can do with a layer cake kind of stack of rocks like that is that the oldest ones will be on the bottom, and then as we go upwards, they'll get younger. So we can get a series of bulk samples through time during interesting intervals of Earth's history. So any given bulk sample bag will look like this. It's, about that size. So a couple of, maybe 2 feet tall, a foot wide. It's usually about 40 or 50 pounds of rocks per bulk sample. Like I said, we break them open with a hammer. We try to find as many things as we can find. Like for example, this is a little clam, and it's a 200 million year old clam. And once we do this for each bulk sample for a time series, so going from older to younger, we can actually reconstruct the seafloor and the organisms that lived on the seafloor during these particular intervals of time. So for example, in this picture, the older bulk samples that we found had a lot of organisms that lived on the surface of the seafloor, like oysters and stuff like that. And over the course of a couple of million years, suddenly those organisms seem to disappear, and they're replaced by organisms that like to burrow into the sediment and things that could swim, like some scallops can swim. So we were interested in why that ecological transition might be. So those are the types of macrofossils that we primarily deal with, actual physical shells, things that we can see. And the reason why we primarily look at shells is because organisms that lived in the ocean, if we want to see what those organisms were up to during some interval of time, shells are made of minerals like calcium carbonate, which can create the rock limestone, if you've ever heard of that. Sometimes if it's been heated and pressurized, it'll turn into marble. It's all the same mineral, calcium carbonate. And shells are made out of that same mineral, which means that when an organism dies and it is on the seafloor or buried in the sediment, it easily becomes a rock and a fossil. So with those shells, if we wanted to figure out how those organisms might have been reacting to things that are happening in the environment or with other organisms that they lived with, we can look for other things within those rocks, like microfossils. So if I was curious about what kinds of predators were living in that same ecosystem, but we don't get like amazing preservation of like perfectly preserved fish or sharks or things that might have been eating those shells, we can actually find lots of teeny microfossils of the things that were eating those shells. And you can see some of these teeth, which are only like a millimeter tall, super tiny, like the width of your hair. Some of these teeth are quite sharp. Some of them are quite rounded, and these rounded teeth would have been the specialized predators that are crunching on those shells, like a nutcracker kind of thing, you know? We can also learn, this is crazy, we can also learn a lot about what volcanoes were doing, especially submarine volcanoes. So when Pangea rifted apart, for example, the first volcanoes that would have been coming up from the continents pulling apart would have been underwater volcanoes, like the ones that are kind of forming Hawaii, kind of. And what happens when you have volcanoes is that they form very quickly. Lava spews out, forms rocks. Those rocks erode really quickly. And all of that releases lots of like dissolved materials into the oceans, like dissolved silica, because that's what most volcanic rocks are made out of. All of that dissolved silica makes certain kinds of sponges that live in the ocean extremely happy, especially these ones that are right here, the hexactinellids. They love dissolved silica. And so when you get a lot of volcanic activity in the ocean, that lava forms basalt rocks. They erode, release tons of dissolved silica into the ocean, and certain sponges that build their skeletons out of dissolved silica suddenly are everywhere. So for that reason, microfossils of sponges tell you about volcanoes. And we call that being a proxy for volcanoes, because we don't have great evidence for the volcanoes themselves because they erode so quickly. But sponges, certain kinds of sponges, react to the presence of volcanoes and their erosion. And so you can use them as a proxy for volcanoes. Crazy, right? One of the most important things that we can do to understand the environments that these organisms were living in any kind of paleontological study is by looking at something called the microfacies, which is basically where we take a rock like this one that has some macrofossils. For example, this is a belemnite. This might have come from here in North Dakota. There's a little ammonite right there, so you can see that ridge here. We can take this rock, and in order to understand what the environment was, the actual environment, was it a beach? Was it deep sea? Was it somewhere in between? What we can do is we take this rock and we use a powerful saw to slice it into a cube, like this. So this is like an actual cube. We polish one side of it until it's literally as smooth as glass, and then we take a piece of glass, like you can see it, we glue it to this rock like this, and we glue it very carefully. So you can see there's the rock on one face. We cut almost the entire rock off here, and what we're left with is just a very thin layer of the rock stuck to the glass. And what this means is that we can put it into a microscope and we can get a really good idea about what's going on the inside of this rock. And what I mean by that is that we can see how big all the grains are. We can see how many shells there are. We can see how broken up the shells are. We can see, have the shells been pressurized and heated so they turn into different minerals. There's all kinds of stuff that one of these little slides can tell you about the organisms, the environment, and what's happened to them since they became a rock. Here are some pictures of some of these things that we call thin sections, because they're very thin sections of rock. We can figure out exactly what organisms are in there, and this is additional data that we can use to tell us about the environments and the materials that organisms are using to build their shells. So here's a close-up of one of these thin sections. I know it doesn't look like much, but each one of these little swirls that you see here, these white lines, some of them are a little rounder than others. Each one of them belonged to an organism, and especially the shell of an organism. So thinking of any given marine organism that makes a shell. So for example, here's an oyster. It doesn't look like much, but that's an organism that cements itself to some hard surface. Here's another shell. This organism probably lives only slightly underneath of the sediment. And here's another shell. This is a very thin-shelled organism. It burrowed deeply into the sediment. Each of these three organisms builds their shell out of calcium carbonate, and that's how they end up as fossils. But the layers that make up their shells have different properties to them. Some of them are more flexible, some of them are more brittle. Some of them are made of a type of calcium carbonate called aragonite that forms much more readily in modern oceans. Others are a little harder to find, like calcite. And these have different properties to them. And this is something that we'll be exploring in my lab, how these different mineral properties were affected by things like predators, things like ocean acidification and global warming, and things like volcanoes. So what we can find by being able to recognize these shell fragments and the types of minerals that these organisms used, we can look at these different layers of something like calcite and aragonite, two different versions of calcium carbonate. In a thin section, we can recognize exactly what kind of properties these minerals hold, be they stronger, more brittle, more flexible, more easily dissolved and more easily formed, or more resistant to dissolution. And we can see how these properties may or may not have been adaptive during intervals of dramatic change, either through predator-prey, through increased volcanism in the oceans, volcanoes in the ocean, or increased global warming, ocean acidification, which also happened at the end of the Triassic period. So each one of these slides, what we can do is we can map out what each thing is and what kind of mineral each thing had. And then we can use that data to form mineral populations and see how those populations changed during interesting intervals of Earth's history. So, for this particular nature program, we're going to be examining shell microstructures, which are lattice structures, mineral lattice structures made by organisms. And that's going to tell us about the strength of these materials. So these are the topics that we're going to explore in this paleontology section. And the questions that we're going to be answering this summer involve: what type of shell structures were most adaptive when crushing predators were proliferating, were becoming more abundant? What types of shell structures were most adaptive when we had supercontinents that were rifting apart and we had volcanoes erupting, spewing lots of weird geochemical things into the oceans, like dissolved silica? And which shell structures were the most adaptive at the very end of the Triassic, when all of this volcanism ultimately caused a mass extinction caused by global warming and ocean acidification from these particular volcanoes? So all of these questions involve looking at shell microstructures in the late Triassic period. And I'm hoping that several of you will join my lab this summer and we can answer these interesting questions together. And I look forward to talking to you soon.